The wind came down from Black Spine Ridge the way trouble always comes quietly at first, then all at once. It was the kind of cold that did not announce itself with drama, but simply
I have the
arrived,
Army's
settled
own
into the
survey
bones of
right
the earth,
here. My
and
claim
began
is
its
valid,
patient work
and
of
you will
elimination.
process it now.
Harrow Flats, Wyoming territory sat in the shallow bowl of a valley that caught wind from 3 directions, and on the night of February 8, 1887, every thermometer in town bottomed out before the mercury could finish its descent. The number was 58 degrees below zero. Not a storm, not a blizzard, just cold, pure, indifferent, and absolute. Inside a low mound on the northern slope of Black Spine Ridge, Verity Calhoun sat awake in the dark, with her right hand pressed flat against her son's chest, counting. She did not count from fear. She counted the way a carpenter checks a level or a navigator checks a compass, methodically without sentiment, because the information mattered. Stellan's heartbeat was slow, steady, the rhythm of deep sleep rather than distress. Beneath her palm, his chest rose, paused, fell, rose again. The air inside the snow dome was not warm in any comfortable sense. It held at perhaps 36 degrees, cold enough to see your breath, cold enough that the buffalo hide beneath them carried a faint stiffness at the edges. But 36 degrees was not 58 below. 36 degrees was survivable. 36 degrees was everything. Outside, the ridge howled. The sound was not loud inside the dome it came through as a deep, low pressure, more felt than heard, like the tremor of a distant train. The snow walls absorbed it, muffled it, turned it into something almost abstract. The small clay firebox on its sandstone hearth held 2 willow sticks, no thicker than Verity's wrist, burning with a flame she kept deliberately small. A tallow lamp added its quiet yellow light to the space. Together, they were barely enough to read by. They were exactly enough to live by. She had been here 4 months. 4 months since she'd driven a stake into the frozen ground of this ridge while Harrow Flats watched and laughed. The laughter felt distant now, the way the wind felt distant, present, but no longer threatening something the walls absorbed. She listened to her son breathe. Somewhere below in the valley, in the log cabins and timber houses that made up the town's ambition, people were making decisions about fire and smoke and frozen doors that would define what morning looked like. She could not help them from here. She had tried to help them earlier, and they had not wanted it. Now the only thing she could do was tend the flame, keep it small, count the breath beside her, and wait for morning to deliver its verdict. She had been a nurse long enough to know that waiting was not passivity. Waiting done correctly was its own form of action. Harrow Flats in September of 1886 was a town that believed in itself the way young men believe in their own bodies, completely without examination, based on no evidence other than the fact that nothing had failed yet. The main street ran straight as a surveyor's line between a general store, a feed supplier, a blacksmith, a one-room schoolhouse, and the 2-story building that served as Aldous Crane's trading post land office and de facto seat of authority. Log walls were going up on every available lot. Wood piles grew taller each afternoon. Shingles were being nailed against the coming weather with the confidence of people who had survived previous winters and mistaken survival for mastery. Verity arrived on a Tuesday with a wagon-loaded light, 2 trunks, a rolled bundle of buffalo hides she traded for at Laramie Stellan's small wooden box of possessions, and a leather medical bag that had belonged to her husband. The bag still had his name stamped into the flap. Sergeant Donald Calhoun, U.S. Army Medical Corps. She had not changed the stamp. She was not sure she would. Stellan rode beside her on the wagon bench, 9 years old, with his father's coloring, that particular shade of light brown hair that turned gold in summer sun and darkened in winter like seasoned wood. He watched everything with the careful attention of a child who had learned that new places required close study before opinions. He didn't ask where they were going or what they were doing. He trusted her navigation the way he trusted gravity, not because he had examined it, but because it had never failed him. Verity had read the Fort Laramie weather report 3 times before leaving. The Army's Meteorological Division had issued it in August, distributed to outposts and settlements along the territory. Most people received it and used it to line pantry shelves. She had read it, recognized what it meant, and begun making different plans. The report described pressure patterns and temperature projections unprecedented in recorded Wyoming Territory history. It described a winter that would not behave like previous winters. It described, in the dry clinical language of Army meteorologists, something that had no name yet, but would eventually be called the Big Die-Up, the winter that killed 60 to 90% of the cattle herds across the northern plains, and introduced the territory to a new understanding of what cold could accomplish when it committed itself. She folded the report and kept it in the medical bag beside Donald's instruments. On her third morning in Harrow Flats, before she'd found lodgings, before she'd registered with the county land office, before she'd introduced herself to anyone beyond the necessary exchanges of commerce, Verity Calhoun drove her wagon to the northern slope of Black Spine Ridge and stopped at a spot where the ground rose at a 40-degree angle, where the wind had been working the snow for weeks already and packing it into something dense, and where if you stood at the right position, you could see the entire bowl of the valley below without being visible from the town. She unloaded a single item from the wagon, a piece of pine board 18 inches long, smooth flat on one side with a plane. She had carved the letters herself over 3 evenings in Laramie, working by lamplight with a small woodworking chisel from Donald's personal effects. The letters read, Donald Calhoun, Sergeant, U.S. Army. She drove it into the frozen ground with a mallet angled into the prevailing wind so it would not be pulled out by the first hard blow. A man from the feed store had followed her at a curious distance. He stood 20 feet back, watching, and finally spoke. You burying somebody up here, ma'am? Verity tested the board's stability with both hands, pushing it gently from side to side, finding it solid. No. The man waited for more. She did not offer more. When he pressed, then what is it for? She straightened and looked at it for a moment before answering. A reminder. She walked back to the wagon, unhitched it, and began to unload the buffalo hides. It was not a grave marker. Donald was buried at Fort Fetterman with military honors. She had not been present for his death, having arrived while she was traveling to reach him. The board on the ridge was something else, a fixed point, a calibration tool, the way surgeons mark the site of a wound before making an incision. Donald had died in a log cabin in January of 1886. The chimney had drawn fine until a hard wind from the north reversed the draft, and by the time anyone found him the following morning, the smoke had done its quiet work. He had been alone. He had built a large fire against the cold. He had died in a building that looked exactly like every other building in the settlement, built the same way, using the same materials by the same logic. She had driven that particular piece of knowledge into the ground on Black Spine Ridge, and she looked at it every morning to make sure she had not forgotten. Aldous Crane was the kind of man whose competence you respected before you examined it. He was 55, broad in the shoulders but heavy in the middle, now the weight of prosperity settling into him the way sediment settles into a river bend. He dressed well for Wyoming Territory: wool coats, proper boots, gloves that actually fit, and he moved through Harrow Flats with the unhurried authority of a man who owned the ground he walked on, which in several cases he literally did. He had arrived in the territory in 1872 with capital and a clear-eyed understanding of what isolated settlements needed supply. He had built a trading monopoly that was never quite called a monopoly because there were technically other suppliers. They were simply not convenient, not available through winter, not willing to extend credit, not in possession of the one reliable road into Harrow Flats. Verity went to see him on her 4th day in town with the Fort Laramie weather report and a straightforward purpose. She did not bring the report to impress him or to argue with him. She brought it because the information in it was critical. She could not act on it alone, and the only person in Harrow Flats with the resources and authority to do something at scale was Aldous Crane. She laid the report on his desk and stood while he read it. He read it the way men read things they've decided in advance are wrong, quickly, with the eyes moving but not the attention. Then he folded it carefully and slid it back across the desk. His tone was not unkind, which was almost worse. Bless the Army's intentions, Mrs. Calhoun, but Fort Laramie is 200 miles from here across different terrain. They don't know Wyoming the way men who've lived here know Wyoming. Verity did not point out that she had asked no man for his Wyoming knowledge. She picked up the report. Then I want to buy 50 board feet of grain-dried pine, seasoned, not green-cut. Crane's expression softened into something commercial and accommodating. He named a price and arranged delivery for the following morning. She paid him, thanked him with the bare minimum of courtesy the situation required, and left. The following morning, she tested the wood the way Donald had taught her to test Supply's knife blade, into the grain, checking resistance and moisture. The wood was green, recently cut, high moisture content, the kind that burns slowly and produces dense smoke and leaves creosote packed in every chimney joint. She loaded it back on the wagon, drove to the trading post, and set it on Crane's counter without ceremony. "This is green wood. I paid for season." Crane did not examine it. He smiled with the patient tolerance of a man explaining something to someone who doesn't quite understand the situation. "Wood is wood, Mrs. Calhoun. Everyone in this settlement uses my stock and I don't receive complaints." She looked at him for a moment. Not with anger, anger was not efficient, but with the focused attention she'd used in field hospitals when a superior officer was about to make an error that would cost lives and had already decided he wasn't making an error. Then she picked up the wood, walked back outside, and made a decision that she'd been moving toward since she'd first seen the fuel situation in this valley. She didn't need his wood. She needed something entirely different. She found old Cass Weiler because she looked for him. People in Harrow Flats mentioned him the way they mention things they don't quite understand, with a combination of dismissiveness and faint unease. "Crazy old mountain man lives up past the North Timberline. Hasn't slept under a real roof in 40 years. Talks to the weather." She had heard three versions of the same description and extracted from all three the same essential fact. Here was a man who had survived Wyoming Territory winters alone and outdoors for 4 decades, and he was still alive. And that meant he knew something the rest of them didn't. She found him on a gray October morning at the edge of the North Timberline, sitting on a fallen log in front of a structure so modest it barely registered as architecture, a low lean-to of packed snow reinforced with pine branches, barely 4 feet high, with a small opening that faced southeast away from the prevailing wind. He was repairing a trap, his hands moving with the economy of a man who has done the same task 10,000 times and no longer needs to think about it. He was 72 years old and did not look like comfort. He looked like a tool that had been used hard and maintained well, tall, angular, with a white beard that reached his chest and pale blue eyes the color of ice over deep water. He did not look up when she approached. Verity did not introduce herself, offer pleasantries, or explain her situation. She took the Fort Laramie weather report from inside her coat and set it on the log beside him. He continued working on the trap for approximately 30 seconds. Then, without changing his posture, he looked at the report with those ice-water eyes. His hand stopped moving. He read it the way she had hoped Crane would read it, actually reading it, letting the numbers do their work. When he finished, he looked up at her for the first time. "You understand this document?" It was not a question, but she answered it. "My husband was an Army medical officer. I read everything he brought home." Cass was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is itself a form of assessment. Then, "Where is your husband?" "Dead, last January, smoke inhalation in a log cabin." He looked at her with an expression that contained no pity, something cleaner than pity, closer to recognition. He set down the trap. He stood up, and he was taller than she'd expected, unfolding from the log, with a deliberateness that suggested his joints had opinions about cold weather. He picked up a length of iron from the ground beside the lean-to, a narrow rod, the kind used for probing soil consistency. "There's wind-packed snow on the upper ridge. Come." He did not wait to see if she followed. What Cass Weiler taught, he taught the way winter teaches, through consequence, rather than instruction. He walked the north face of Black Spine Ridge with the iron probe, pressing it into different snow formations, with the practiced attention of someone reading a language the rest of the territory didn't know existed. He showed her the difference between surface snow that had fallen and settled loose and treacherous, and wind-packed snow that had been compressed over weeks into something with structural integrity. The probe entered soft snow too easily. It disappeared to the elbow with almost no resistance. Dense, over-compacted crust sent the rod back against the palm. What she needed was specific resistance that built gradually, evenly, that gave a dry whisper when a blade moved through it. He handed her the probe. She tried 3 locations before finding the 4th, where the resistance felt like pushing a blade through firm clay. She looked at him. He gave a single nod. She had not found it by accident. She had been reading the terrain as he walked it, cataloging what his body language told her before the probe confirmed it. She understood then that Cass was not teaching her snow. He was teaching her to observe. The snow was just the medium. Stellan had followed them up the ridge at a cautious distance, close enough to watch, far enough to stay out of the way. Cass noticed him without acknowledging him directly. He bent down, scooped a handful of surface powder, and let it fall. It scattered immediately in the slight wind. Then he picked up a chunk of the wind-packed formation and let it drop. It hit the ground and held its shape, breaking apart only where it struck. Stellan watched this with his total attention. Cass picked up another chunk and handed it to the boy without comment. Stellan held it, squeezed it, felt how it compressed slightly under pressure, but resisted dissolution. He set it down carefully as if it might be important later. It was the most intelligent response available, and Cass watched it happen with an expression that shifted almost imperceptibly towards something like approval. That evening, Cass set 2 tin cups of water at Verity's campsite, one on the ground, one elevated on a flat rock 18 inches up. He said nothing about them. In the morning, Stellan checked both before his mother was fully awake. The cup on the ground had a 1/4 inch of ice across its surface. The elevated cup was completely liquid. He brought both cups to Verity with the careful precision of someone delivering evidence. She examined them. She thought about what she knew about cold air density, about how cold sought the lowest available space the way water seeks the lowest level. She looked at her son. "What does that tell you?" Stellan considered it with the seriousness of a child who has been trusted with a real question. "Don't sleep on the ground. That's part of it." She set both cups down. "Build the floor you don't want to sleep in first, then build the floor you do." The work began in the second week of October, and it did not go unnoticed. Harrow Flats had the particular quality of small settlements where everyone's business was visible by necessity and discussed by tradition. The sight of a widow woman and her 9-year-old son hauling blocks of snow up the north face of Black Spine Ridge attracted commentary the way unusual weather attracted commentary, with the combined interest of people who find something both baffling and faintly threatening. Aldous Crane watched from the flat ground at the base of the slope on the third day. He had with him Jonas Burrell, who was the best carpenter in the settlement, and knew it the way craftsmen know their own value, not arrogantly exactly, but with the settled certainty of a man whose skills have been tested and confirmed repeatedly. Jonas was 44, built for physical work, with hands that could assess the quality of a timber joint through touch alone. He watched Verity cut snow blocks with a long-bladed ice saw and stack them in a way that made no architectural sense to him at all. Not horizontal courses, not plumb lines, but a pattern that seemed to spiral inward and upward simultaneously. Crane called up the slope, planning to move into a snowbank. Mrs. Calhoun, she did not look up from the cut she was making. Planning to move into a home. A snow home. The phrase in Crane's voice carried exactly the distance between amusement and contempt that made it useful as social pressure without being clearly rude. Must be an Eastern idea. She didn't respond. Jonas Burrell studied the construction with a more professional skepticism. He watched the way she was angling each block against the previous one, using the weight and angle of each piece to reinforce its neighbor. It violated everything he knew about structural logic. A wall needed to be plumb. Weight needed to transfer straight down. This was doing something different, something he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. He did not say this. He said, "That wall won't stand. The angle's wrong." Verity placed the next block, checked it with her palm for contact points, packed loose snow into the joint with her other hand. She had been saving the broken and irregular blocks in a separate pile for exactly this, the loose material pressed into gaps with better compression force and better conformity than any solid block could achieve alone. Stellan was watching Jonas from 20 feet away with that careful cataloging attention he'd inherited from neither parent, but had developed entirely on his own as a survival mechanism in the particular circumstances of his life. He had heard himself called the snowboy twice already by children his age in the settlement. He had stored this information without visible reaction, the way you store the location of a loose floorboard, not to avoid it forever, but to know exactly where it is. By the end of the first week, the base courses were laid, the floor excavated to create the cold sump below. Sleeping level, the entrance tunnel dug and bent at its necessary angle to create the cold trap. The form of the structure was becoming visible to anyone watching, though what they were seeing they were interpreting through the only architecture they knew. Crane looked at the rounded base and called it a burrow. A woman from the settlement near Widow Creek saw Stellan playing at the entrance tunnel and said loudly enough to carry, "A little boy needs a timber roof over his head, not a fox den." Stellan's eyes dropped to the ground for a moment. Then he picked up the block he'd been shaping and carried it to his mother. Crane 2 days later made a more substantial move. He began offering seasoned, properly dried timber at half price to any family that had been observed watching Verity's construction. Not to everyone, specifically to the families showing interest. The implication was not spoken, but it was available to anyone paying attention. Alignment with the new method carried a material cost. Alignment with Crane's established order carried a reward. Jonas Burrell received a personal delivery of the finest pine stock Crane had in storage, with a note in Crane's handwriting. A craftsman with proper materials has no need of improvisation. Jonas read the note, looked at the lumber. It was genuinely good wood, dry and straight-grained, and he stacked it beside his cabin without making any public statement about where his allegiances lay. Verity found the critical flaw in the construction on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and it cost her 2 hours of dug material. She had been cutting blocks from a formation near an old willow stand at the base of the slope. The surface read correctly on the probe. The initial cuts were clean and dry. Then her blade reached a lower stratum, and a corner of the block collapsed into loose crystals. She lifted what remained, studied the broken edge, and understood a water seam in the substrate, frozen but structurally weak, invisible from the surface. Weeks of wind had packed the top layer into apparent solidity, while the layer beneath stayed compromised. She did not try to use the damaged block. She set it aside, and when Stellan asked if they were throwing it away, she looked at the pile of loose material and the gaps between the solid blocks she'd already placed. It still has work to do. The broken material became the packing compound for irregular joints pressed into narrow seams with more compression force and better conformity than any block could achieve. Nothing was discarded. Everything found the correct function. Cass came by that evening and looked at the day's progress without comment. Then he looked at the willow stand. "You went near the creek drainage." It was not a question. Water memory in the substrate. Doesn't matter how cold the surface is. He picked up the iron probe and pressed it into the ground near the willow roots. The resistance was wrong, too soft beneath the surface crust. He handed the probe back. "What did you do with the bad blocks?" She showed him the packed joints. He examined them with his fingertips pressing into the seams. He nodded once, not approval exactly, but the acknowledgement of someone watching a correct decision happen in real time. She was about to set the probe against the wall when Cass stopped her with a gesture. "Keep it up here." He did not explain further. She understood the probe belonged to this slope, now to this process. There would be more testing before the construction was finished. There were always more tests. The dome closed in the first week of November. The final block, the king block shaped into a wide wedge, had given her a problem that Cass watched her work through without offering solutions. The aperture at the top was not a standard shape. The courses she'd laid spiraling as they climbed had left an opening with irregular angles on each side. A square block would not seat. A circle would not fill the gaps. She needed a piece that was simultaneously wedge, keystone, and cap, that would slide in from above cant against the irregular surfaces and lock into compression rather than resting on them. She shaped 5 attempts before the 6th seated correctly. When she eased it down into the opening and felt the weight shift through the whole structure, not settling, distributing, she took her hands away and stepped back. Nothing moved. Stellan had been counting blocks aloud for the past 2 hours, in a low, continuous murmur that she'd found oddly grounding, like the sound of a creek. When she stepped back, the counting stopped. He walked to the dome and put his small fist against the side and knocked on it the way he'd seen Cass test ice thickness on ponds. The sound came back dense, solid, without the hollow register of something that might fail. "That's a real roof," he said with the absolute confidence of 9 years old recognizing truth. Cass, who had been watching from the slope above, walked down and looked at the structure for 30 seconds. He ran one hand along the joint where the king block met the course below, it feeling for gaps or movement. He found neither. He stepped back and looked at the whole form, the dome rising from the packed snow of the ridge, the entrance tunnel angling away to the east, the smoke vent at the crown. Then Donald Calhoun was a fortunate man. He turned and walked back up the slope. Verity stood with her hand still on the wall. The pine board with her husband's name was 30 feet away, angled into the prevailing wind, holding its position in the frozen ground exactly as she'd intended. She looked at it for a moment. She did not disagree with Cass. She did not agree either. She was not finished learning what kind of man Donald Calhoun had been, and she was not sure she could assess that from the outside of a building he'd never lived in. She touched the wall once more and went inside to light the first fire. The first fire was too large. She knew it was too large when she lit it, and she let it burn anyway, not from sentiment, but from data collection. She needed to know exactly what too large looked like inside this specific structure in these specific ambient conditions before the temperature outside reached the levels the Fort Laramie report described. A mistake made in November with the thermometer at 15 below zero was recoverable. A mistake made in February at 50 below was not. By midnight, the dome was warmer than it had been at dusk, noticeably warmer, and the warmth had the wrong quality, not the steady maintained temperature of a system in balance, but the climbing heat of a fire competing with its container. She lay awake for 2 hours after Stellan fell asleep monitoring. At 2 in the morning, she reduced the fire to a single stick and watched the temperature stop its climb. At 6, she woke to find a thin shell of ice on the interior wall surface, exactly what she'd anticipated. This was the lesson Donal had never had the chance to learn. A roaring fire in a snow shelter doesn't fight the cold. It fights the shelter itself, pushing heat into the snow walls fast enough to melt the surface, which refreezes as the heat withdraws, which creates ice that changes the insulative properties of the snow, which requires more fire, which melts more surface. The cycle ended only when the structure failed or the fire ran out of fuel. A modest sustained flame raised the internal temperature to a survivable range without pushing heat fast enough to reach the snow walls. The wall stayed snow insulated. The system held. She scraped the ice off the interior wall with the back of her knife and studied the moisture trail it left. She spread the buffalo hides she'd brought from Laramie, not directly against the wall, but held an inch away from it by rawhide loops nailed into the packed snow, creating a pocket of still air between the hide and the wall surface. The principle was direct dead air did work that no material alone could replicate. Cass appeared mid-morning. He looked at the ice traces on the wall, the position of the buffalo hides, the fire already reduced to 2 sticks burning with controlled patience. He looked at these things in sequence the way a doctor looks at signs, not each one alone, but the pattern they made together. You made the fire too big last night. Yes, you knew you were going to. She met his ice-water eyes. I needed to see what it looked like from the inside. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, closer to the recognition of a specific kind of mind encountering its own reflection. He picked up the 2 tin cups that Stellan had left near the firebox. He refilled them from the water skin, set them at their respective heights. He handed the iron probe to Stellan, who was watching from the sleeping shelf with the patient alertness of a child who has learned that the best position during important adult conversations is invisible but present. Tomorrow morning, Cass said to the boy, you're going to test the walls with this, not to check if they're cold, to check where the cold is moving. He demonstrated the angle not perpendicular to the wall surface, but at 45 degrees, reading the depth of temperature change rather than the surface. Stellan took the rod with both hands and held it with the seriousness of someone who has been trusted with an instrument. Cass straightened and looked at Verity. The fire you're keeping now is the right fire. She already knew, but she understood why he said it. After weeks of not confirming anything, confirming this was its own kind of instruction, they had arrived at the point where the knowledge was no longer theoretical. The dome held its temperature through the night. 36 degrees, not comfortable, not safe by the standards of any life she had lived before this one, but survivable in a way that no false warmth could imitate. Outside, November pressed itself against the walls with the quiet assurance of something that had all winter to make its argument. Inside, the small flame did its precise, disciplined work, and the snow did what snow had always done when you stopped fighting it and started working with it instead. She lay in the dark that second night with Stellan sleeping beside her, his breath visible in the lamplight, his right hand curled loose near his chin, the way Donal's hand had curled in sleep, that particular gesture of unconscious peace that children carry from their fathers, the way they carry eye color or the way they laugh. She watched it for a long moment. Then she adjusted the draft, keeping the flame exactly where it needed to be, and turned her attention back to the walls. There was still a great deal of winter ahead. She intended to learn every piece of it. In the second week of November, Harrow Flats made its position official. Not through any formal declaration, settlements of that size operated on social pressure rather than governance. When governance was inconvenient, but through the particular mechanics of collective opinion that function the same way in every human gathering. First ignoring, then mocking, then making the mockery public enough that silence felt like endorsement of the wrong side. Crane organized it without appearing to organize it the way skilled men of commerce organize things they want but cannot be seen wanting. He mentioned in the trading post within earshot of 5 or 6 of the settlement's more vocal citizens that he'd heard the Calhoun woman was planning to winter on the North Slope. He expressed mild concern for her welfare with a particular cadence that invites others to express the same concern more loudly and with less restraint than he himself could afford. By the following morning, the concern had metabolized into commentary, and the commentary had acquired the specific flavor of Harrow Flats at its most communally certain. A group of men from the Widow Creek cabins came up the slope on a Wednesday morning with the loose purpose of people who have decided to watch something fail. They stood at a distance that was technically polite and watched Verity work. Their commentary was not directed at her. It was directed at each other in voices calibrated to carry. One of them used the phrase snow tomb twice. Another said something about Eastern women not understanding Western winters. A third, a rancher named Whitmore, who had been in the territory 7 years and wore that fact like a credential, described the construction method as what you do when you can't build a real structure. Stellan heard all of it. He was working 20 feet from his mother shaping blocks with a smaller saw Cass had left for him, and he had the good sense to keep working and keep his face neutral. But she saw his shoulders change. She saw the precise way a child absorbs language meant to wound, not dramatically, not with tears, but with a small particular contraction that was worse than either. She did not address the men, she addressed her son. She stopped her work, walked to where he was standing, and took the block he'd been shaping from his hands. She examined its edges. It was good work, the corners clean, the faces even. She handed it back. This one's ready for the upper course. Third position from the east. He nodded. He carried the block to the structure and placed it with the care of someone placing something important. The men watched. Gradually, they lost interest in watching, which was what she'd been waiting for. That evening, after Stellan was asleep, she sat near the firebox and thought about the physics of what Whitmore had dismissed. The dome they were building was based on principles that predated every log cabin in Wyoming territory by centuries. The principles worked because cold air was denser than warm air and sought the lowest available space, because a dome distributed load more efficiently than a vertical wall, because snow at the correct density provided insulation that no timber structure had ever replicated without additional material added post-construction. These were not cultural facts, they were physical facts. They did not change their nature based on who had built what on which slope. She reached into the medical bag and took out the Fort Laramie report. She read the temperature projections one more time in the low lamplight. The numbers had not changed. What they described was still coming, and it was coming for everyone in the valley, regardless of what they thought about who was building what on the north slope of Black Spine Ridge. She folded the report back along its original creases and put it away. She adjusted the fire. She went to sleep. What Crane did not know, and what would prove to be the particular miscalculation of his winter, was that Jonas Burrell, despite the fine lumber delivery and the implicit alignment it represented, had been watching the construction with professional attention, uncomplicated by the social obligations of public commentary. Jonas was a craftsman. Craftsmen observe what they cannot explain, not because they are humble by temperament, but because they understand that unexplained things that work are more dangerous to ignore than unexplained things that don't. He had watched Verity lay the spiral courses and told himself it was wrong. He had watched the dome rise and told himself it would fail. He had come back 3 times now to check if it had failed, and each time it had not failed, and he was running out of vocabulary for what he was observing. He came alone on a Friday morning in late November when the dome was finished, and Verity was working on the entrance tunnel's final angle. He examined the structure without speaking, running his carpenter's hands along the joints, pressing into the seams, testing the king block with the heel of his hand. The sound it returned was the sound he'd heard the dome make from 40 feet away and had not been able to account for low solid without resonance. He looked at the entrance tunnel, looked at the angle of its termination, the sharp turn that forced anyone entering to pass through the lowest point before rising to the living space. He saw for the first time that it was not a design choice made from stubbornness or ignorance. It was a physics problem that had been solved correctly. The cold trap. Cold air falls, settles in the lowest point of the tunnel, stays there. Warm air in the living space rises and remains undisturbed. The entrance does not allow the outside atmosphere to communicate directly with the interior atmosphere. It was in the vocabulary of his craft a load-bearing solution, not aesthetic, not conventional, but functionally irreplaceable. He straightened and looked at Verity, who had been watching him without pretense at not watching him. "How many of these have you built?" "This is the first." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you know the angle of the tunnel?" "I thought about where the cold would go if I gave it the lowest point first." She pressed another section of packed snow into the tunnel wall. "Then I made sure the lowest point wasn't where I was sleeping." Jonas nodded slowly with the particular nod of a man who has just understood something he's going to need to think about for several days. He picked up a spare block from the pile she'd cut and examined it. Set it down, picked up the small saw. She watched him figure out the cutting angle from observation in about 30 seconds. He made one cut. The block face was clean, the angle correct. He set the saw down and looked at what he'd made. "Then Crane's wood is green." "I know. He's been selling green wood to half the settlement at season prices. I have the only dry stock in Harrow Flats, and it came from him as a gift." He said this last part the way you say a thing that you've been not saying for 2 weeks and can no longer not say. "I didn't ask why he was giving it to me." "You know why." Jonas looked at the dome one more time. Then he picked up his coat and began walking back down the slope. At the edge of the flat ground, he stopped without turning around. "If somebody needed to build one of these before the next hard cold, how long would it take?" Verity calculated. 2 experienced builders, proper snow conditions 1 week. 1 experienced builder and an assistant who was learning 10 days. 1 woman who'd made every mistake already, and 1 9-year-old who'd cataloged all of them 8 days. She told him 8 days. He nodded at the ground in front of him and kept walking. The last thing she did before the first serious cold arrived was scatter loose powder snow across the outside of the dome's walls. It was the final step, the one Cass had called the storm skin fine powder, that settled into every micro crack and surface irregularity, sealing the exterior against the needle-fine wind that otherwise found its way through even well-fitted joints. She had done this in the last light of a November afternoon, Stellan working beside her with a wide flat board to scatter the powder evenly, both of them moving around the dome in decreasing circles until every surface had its second skin. When they finished, the dome looked different. Not larger, not more impressive, simpler. More complete. The way a thing looks when it has found its correct form and stopped needing to be anything other than what it is. Stellan stood back and looked at it with his head slightly tilted. The last light was nearly gone. The first stars were coming through a sky that had turned the particular dark blue that Wyoming sky turns in November when the cold is preparing to clarify. The pine board with his father's name on it stood 30 feet away, silver gray, in the fading light, still holding its position in the frozen ground. He looked at the board and then at the dome. He looked at these 2 things together for a moment in the way children make connections that adults make later, and with more words, "Pa didn't know how to do this." Verity looked at the dome. Nobody showed him. "You figured it out." "Cass helped. You helped." She put her hand briefly on the back of his neck, not a gesture of comfort exactly, more the way you touch a structure you've built together to confirm it's still standing. "Go inside and keep the fire small." He went inside. She stood for another minute in the dark and the cold, looking at the dome, looking at the board with Donald's name, feeling the particular weight of knowing that the thing that killed him was not inevitable, that it had been preventable with knowledge that existed and had simply not been made available to him. She did not know whether to call that tragedy or ordinary human waste. She had seen enough of both in her years of nursing to know that the line between them was thinner than people wanted to believe. She went inside, settled the entrance hide, and adjusted the fire to exactly what it needed to be. Not large, not dramatic, not impressive. Small, steady, patient. The kind of fire you could trust. The first hard cold arrived without ceremony on a Thursday night in December, dropping out of the north like a blade finding its angle. The thermometer outside the Harrow Flats general store read 31 below zero by midnight, which was the kind of number that changed the texture of air itself, not merely cold but dense, pressing a physical presence rather than an absence of warmth. Verity was awake when it arrived. She felt it in the way the dome's exterior surface responded, a faint deepening of the silence that came through the walls when outside temperature dropped fast enough to contract the snow crystals. She adjusted the fire by feel, adding half a stick, watching the flame's behavior for 30 seconds before deciding the draft was correct. Then she lay back down. She was asleep within minutes. That was new. 6 weeks ago, the first cold night had kept her rigid with attention until dawn. Now her body had learned to trust the system the way it had once learned to trust surgical procedure, not through confidence exactly, but through the accumulation of evidence that when done correctly, the thing worked. What woke her was not cold, it was sound. Stellan's hand on her shoulder at 2 in the morning, his voice careful with the particular restraint of a child who has learned that alarm should be proportional to actual information. "Mama, somebody's calling from down the slope." She was dressed before he finished the sentence. The medical bag was already moving with her through the entrance tunnel, her hands finding it in the dark by location rather than sight. Outside, the cold struck her face like a flat palm. The sound came again from below, not a scream, something more exhausted than that, a sustained calling that had been going on long enough for the caller to have run out of panic and moved into the grim mechanical work of being heard. She moved down the slope toward it. The Burrell cabin sat 80 yards from Widow Creek, near enough to the water that the ground beneath it stayed damp through freeze cycles, which was part of why the logs had never cured properly after construction. Jonas had built it in the first year he'd come to Harrow Flats, before he'd understood Wyoming's particular relationship with moisture. He'd built it well by the standards he'd been taught, which were Pennsylvania standards, which were wrong for this climate, in 3 specific ways he'd never had reason to examine until tonight. The wind from Black Spine Ridge had been backing around from the northeast for 6 hours, which shifted it to the precise angle that killed chimney draft in the Widow Creek cabins, not by blocking the flue, but by creating positive pressure at the chimney cap, turning the usual updraft into a downdraft that pushed smoke back through the stovepipe into the living space. It happened in slow degrees, the way dangerous things often happen. First a slight haze in the upper room, then a smell, then the haze thickening to actual visibility, then the realization arriving several minutes later than it should have. Jonas had broken the window with his elbow because the door was frozen in its frame. Moisture in the log joints had swelled then frozen, sealing the fit so completely that the latch mechanism was irrelevant. He'd broken the glass, pushed through the frame, dropped to the snow. His forearm was cut from elbow to wrist where the glass had caught him, the blood already slowing in the cold, beginning the process of freezing at the wound edges. Hattie had come through the window after him with Rosie wrapped against her chest. The little girl's face slack in the particular way that was not sleep, but something the other side of sleep shock, pulling the body's resources inward. Verity knelt in the snow beside them, the medical bag open, her hands already moving. She had seen smoke inhalation in field hospitals, men pulled from burning supply tents, their lips the color of old bruises, their breathing shallow with the characteristic rhythm of airways that had inhaled what they were not designed to inhale. Rosie was 3 years old. Her body's reserves were not the reserves of an adult. Verity worked with the focused efficiency of someone for whom emergency was not exceptional, but professional, checking airway, tilting the small head back to the correct angle, watching the chest, monitoring the lip color in the moonlight for the shift from blue back toward pink that would tell her the child was getting enough oxygen now that she was away from the source. It took 4 minutes, the longest 4 minutes Hattie Burrell had experienced in her life, standing in the snow in her nightgown at 31 below zero, watching a woman she had publicly avoided for 2 months work on her daughter with hands that did not tremble. The lip color shifted. Rosie coughed a productive cough, the right kind, the kind that meant the airway was clearing. Her eyes opened unfocused, then focused on her mother's face with the raw urgency of a child returning from somewhere frightening. Hattie made a sound that had no word for it in any language Verity knew. Jonas was standing to one side, his cut arm held against his body, watching all of this with the expression of a man whose competence in his own domain has just been shown to be insufficient for the domain that actually mattered. Verity bound his forearm with gauze from the bag tight enough to hold loose enough not to restrict circulation. She worked without sentiment. When she finished, she looked at Hattie directly. "Tonight you'll stay here in the cold, or you'll bring your daughter up the slope. Those are the choices." She did not soften it. Softening it would have been a disservice to Rosie. Hattie looked at Jonas. Jonas looked at his cabin, the broken window, the smoke still visible at the eaves, the door that had refused to open. He looked at it the way you look at something you built with your own hands that has just tried to kill your child. "We're going up the slope," his voice carrying no argument, no qualification. By morning, word had moved through Harrow Flats with the speed that bad news always moved in small settlements, faster than any messenger arriving ahead of any explanation, carrying all the alarm, but none of the context. Three other families had spent the night managing smoke in various degrees of severity, none as critical as the Burrells, but none comfortable. The chimneys that had drawn perfectly through October had revealed their design flaw at the specific wind angle that December provided. This was not a flaw in any individual chimney. It was a flaw in the logic that had placed all of them vertical flues in structures built on flat ground, with no deflection from the prevailing wind, in a climate where the prevailing wind changed angles seasonally in ways that Pennsylvania winters never required you to account for. Aldous Crane called a community meeting that same morning. He moved quickly, which was something Verity gave him. He understood when narrative needed to be controlled, and he did not wait for others to shape it first. The meeting was in the Trading Post, the largest interior space in Harrow Flats, and it was filled before the appointed hour because cold gives people a strong preference for being in rooms with other people. Crane opened by expressing concern. He expressed it genuinely. She did not doubt that he felt concern, that he was capable of it, that the Burrell situation had alarmed him as much as anyone. But the concern was also useful, and Crane had the particular skill of men who succeed in commerce, the ability to let useful things serve double purposes without the usefulness contaminating the sincerity. His proposed solution arrived after 3 minutes of concern. The community fund should be used to purchase additional timber for reinforcing cabin construction. He happened to have a substantial supply available. The price he named was 40% above what he charged in September. He framed this as civic responsibility. He did not mention that the timber he was proposing to sell was the same green-cut stock he'd been moving all season, the stock that produced more smoke per cord than seasoned wood, the stock that would make the draft problem worse before the winter made it worse further. He may not have known this consciously. What she could say was that the effect was identical whether the cause was ignorance or calculation. She did not speak during this meeting. She sat near the back with Stellan beside her, listening, watching the room's response to Crane's proposal. Most of the faces showed relief. Here was an authority offering a solution, which was what frightened people in a cold room needed. Jonas Burrell sat near the front with his bandaged arm across his chest and said nothing. Pastor Emmett Voss, who was 50 years old, gray-bearded with the careful eyes of a man who read people the way he read scripture, looking for what the words actually meant rather than what they appeared to mean, was watching Crane. Not the room. Crane. The meeting ended with no formal vote, but with the understanding that Crane's timber would be available. Verity walked out into the cold without having contributed a word. Cass came to the dome that evening. He sat by the firebox for several minutes without speaking. Then Crane's running the same play he runs every time something goes wrong, becomes the solution to the problem he helped create. He said it without particular heat observation, not accusation, the tone of someone describing weather patterns. Verity set the 2 tin cups in their positions, new water in each. He may not know his wood is causing part of the draft problem. He knows his wood is green. He sold it as seasoned. Cass looked at the fire with those pale eyes. A man who sells you the wrong tool and then sells you a second tool to fix the damage the first one did, whether he planned it or stumbled into it, the effect is the same. She thought about Rosie Burrell's lip color in the moonlight shifting from blue to pink. She thought about the weight of a 3-year-old's body, the particular fragility of small lungs. He needs to know about the draft problem, not as an accusation, as physics. Cass looked at her. You think that changes anything? I think physics doesn't care whether he believes it. Cass was quiet for a while. Then, in the particular voice he used when he was about to tell her something that belonged to the category of things she needed but hadn't asked for. 1851. I was running trap lines on this ridge in November. My horse broke a foreleg and a creek crossing the ice gave way. I put the horse down, cached what I could carry, started walking back toward the nearest settlement. Storm came in overnight. 73 days. She did not speak. She understood that this was not a story about surviving. It was a story about what 73 days of paying total attention to the thing that was trying to kill you does to the way you see everything afterward. I didn't build the first shelter right. Cass continued, his voice carrying the flat precision of a man describing a technical error. Too low, no cold trap in the entrance. First night I thought I'd be dead by morning. Second night I rebuilt it. He looked at the fire. You learn faster when you have no option but to learn. That's the only advantage of no options. Verity thought about Donal about what he might have learned if he'd had 73 days to pay attention instead of a single January night. She thought about the difference between learning at a pace you choose and learning at the pace the situation sets for you. I'm not waiting for the situation to teach them. Cass nodded once slowly, and she understood that this was the closest he came to saying she was right. In the second week of December, Jonas Burrell climbed the slope on a morning when the temperature had risen back to single digits below zero. He came alone carrying a spade over one shoulder. He did not bring an apology. He brought instead the thing that was more useful than an apology. In a Wyoming winter, the willingness to start from the beginning without pretense that he knew where the beginning was. He stood at the edge of the worksite, looked at the dome, looked at the cold sump excavation that was visible near the entrance, looked at the sleeping platform with its raised elevation above the main floor. Then he set the spade down in front of Verity and asked, "Where do I start?" She pointed to the ground 30 feet north. "Dig down 2 feet, then we'll talk about what you find." He dug. The permafrost fought him for the first 6 inches, then gave way to a denser substrate that was harder but more consistent. She watched him work for 20 minutes, then came over and looked at what he'd exposed. She showed him how to test the layers with the iron probe, not for stability this time, but for drainage patterns for the water memory in the substrate that would determine where the cold sump should be positioned. He understood the probe in about 3 tests, his carpenter's hands reading the resistance variations with the same instinctive precision he used for wood grain assessment. Different material, identical skill. She did not compliment him on this. She moved to the next technical problem. They worked through the morning in a collaboration that had no warmth in it. Initially, only the shared focus of two competent people solving a problem that required both of them. Stellan worked alongside Jonas, and something about the boy's matter-of-fact inclusion. No resentment, no acknowledgement of the previous weeks. Just "here's the next block, here's the angle it needs," seemed to disarm whatever defensive posture Jonas had arrived with. By noon, the base of Jonas's dome was excavated, and the first snow blocks were being tested. His cuts were better than hers had been on the first day his carpentry instincts found the angles faster than she had. But he made the same foundational error she had made going for the smoother surface snow near the creek drainage, rather than the wind-packed stock from the upper ridge, and she let him make it watching without intervening, waiting for the block to fail under his hands. When it did collapsing at a lower stratum exactly as hers had, he looked at the rubble for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the pile of irregular pieces she'd been using for joint packing. "That goes in the seams," he said. Not a question. "Every piece has a function." He nodded and moved back toward the upper ridge to find the correct snow. She did not need to tell him why. He was already thinking the way the material required him to think. The community meeting Crane called in the third week of December had a different character from the first. He had engaged a young man named Webb Granger, 25 years old, recently arrived from Illinois to serve as what Crane described as a structural safety inspector for the settlement. Webb had no qualifications beyond a document Crane had written and signed himself, but the document had official-looking language, and Webb had an official-looking manner. And in a frightened settlement in December, official-looking things carried weight they did not always deserve. Webb climbed the slope on a Thursday morning with a clipboard in a manner calibrated to convey authority to people who might not examine its basis too closely. He moved from dome to dome on the ridge. There were 6 now, with Jonas's nearly complete and attached to each one. A notice of structural non-compliance with settlement safety standards as established by the Harrow Flats Community Council. The notice was on paper that had Crane's trading post watermark along one edge. It stated that non-compliant structures must be vacated within 14 days pending review, or the occupants would lose access to the community fuel supply. Verity read the notice attached to her dome with the careful attention she gave all documents. She read it twice. She noted the absence of any actual structural standard, cited the absence of any citation of authority beyond the community council, the absence of any inspection criteria. She noted the trading post watermark. She removed the notice from her door, folded it along its original creases, walked down the slope to Crane's trading post, knocked on the door, waited for him to open it, and without a word pressed the folded notice flat against the door with her palm. She held it there for a moment, not theatrically, just long enough for the adhesion to take, and walked back up the slope. Crane opened his door 30 seconds later and looked at the notice on his own door with an expression that moved through several phases rapidly. He removed it, folded it, put it in his coat pocket. He did not come up the slope. He did not send Webb back. But the fuel supply restriction notice went out to every family on the ridge the following morning through written delivery, which meant it was now documented, which meant it had moved from social pressure to something with edges that could cut in multiple directions. Sheriff Clem Aldgate came to see Verity that afternoon. He was a fair man in the specific sense that he tried to apply the law consistently to people he liked and people he didn't, which was rarer than it should have been. He sat on the snow outside her dome because there was no seating she could offer him that wasn't inside, which would have required him to officially be a guest rather than a representative of the settlement's legal order. He showed her the fuel restriction notice. He looked at it as he showed it to her, not at her. "I can't enforce something that doesn't have a legal basis, Mrs. Calhoun, but I also can't stop him from deciding who he sells to on private property." "I know." She looked at the notice. "The families on this slope need dry fuel. The restriction on community supply affects 6 households, 4 of which have children." Aldgate looked uncomfortable in the specific way of men who understand that right and legal are not the same word. "What do you need from me?" "Be at the community meeting next week." She handed the notice back. "That's all." The storm that arrived on the last day of December did not announce itself the way December storms usually announce themselves, with dropping pressure wind shifts. The particular quality of light that experienced Wyoming residents had learned to read as a signal to get inside. It came fast from the northwest, with the compressed speed of weather that has been building force across 500 miles of open plain. By the time the first flakes reached Harrow Flats, the wind was already at 40 miles per hour and climbing. Verity was checking the storm skin on the upper courses of the dome when the first gust came through the ridge gap with enough force to move her sideways. She got inside. Stellan was already there, had already moved from the sleeping shelf to the main floor to check the draft on the firebox, had already reduced the flame to the correct size without being told. She watched him do this with the specific pride that has nothing to do with sentiment, the pride of watching a skill transfer completely, of knowing that the knowledge was no longer only in her hands. The wind built through the night. The dome handled it. Snow structures under wind load do not behave like timber structures. They flex in ways that would crack a log wall, redistributing stress through the curved geometry of the dome shape rather than concentrating it at joints. She had understood this theoretically. Feeling it happen was different. The walls moved in a way that was perceptible, but not alarming, a slow breath rather than a struggle, and the king block above held without a creak. What she heard at 3 in the morning was not the storm. It was Stellan sitting up, his head tilted in the listening posture she recognized. Something on the slope, south of us. She went outside into a wall of wind and snow that reduced visibility to 8 feet. The sound came in fragments between gusts. Voices, more than one, carrying the particular frequency of people who were frightened, but not yet panicking, which meant they'd been frightened long enough to run out of panic. She moved toward the sound with her hand on the slope to keep her orientation. The Garrity family's dome. Thomas, his wife May, their 2 children, had taken a direct hit from a section of dead cottonwood that had been standing at the ridge's edge for years, held in place by the frozen ground through previous winters, finally pulled loose by the combined force of root freeze expansion from a week of temperature cycling. The branch had caught the dome on its eastern face, tearing through the storm skin and the upper third of the wall, collapsing the king block into the interior. The family was unharmed, but exposed to full wind through the gap in the roof, and the interior temperature was dropping at a rate she calculated at roughly 8 degrees per 10 minutes. She had materials ready because she had made it a practice to keep surplus snowblock stock cut within 30 feet of the dome at all times. She had started this habit after the first night, when she'd understood that repair at speed in bad conditions was a different task from construction at leisure in good ones. Surplus stock on hand was the difference between managing a crisis and surviving it. She worked in the dark with the wind at her back, fitting blocks into the breach by touch packing joints with loose snow. She scooped from the surface with her bare hands because there was no time to find gloves. Her hands lost feeling in the fingers after 12 minutes. She kept working. The nerve endings going quiet was information, not an emergency. She trained herself to distinguish between information and emergency in field hospitals, where both arrived simultaneously, and the ability to sort them was the entire job. Cass appeared out of the storm with a lantern, its flame surviving the wind inside a glass chimney that he held close to his body. He did not offer to take over the repair work. He held the light so she could see the courses she was laying, angling it to show the contact points between blocks, moving it as she moved. Stellan had followed her. She hadn't known until she turned for more packing material and found him behind her holding the loose snow she needed in his coat, bundled in front of him like an apron. He passed it to her without comment. She packed the joint. He went back for more. When the breach was sealed and the storm skin patched with fresh powder tamped into the surface cracks, she stood back in the wind and looked at the repair. It was not beautiful. It would hold. She looked at her son, at the snow in his coat, at his face calm with the particular calm of a child who has discovered that his competence is real rather than imaginary. The wind came over the ridge in another sustained gust. They both leaned into it automatically, the posture of people who had stopped being surprised by the wind's intentions. "Go check the fire," she said. He went. The community meeting Crane called in the second week of January was held in his own building rather than a neutral space, which told her everything about how he expected it to proceed. He had arranged the seating so that the Ridge family, 6 of them, now including the Garrities, were naturally positioned at the edges of the room, visually peripheral to the main body of the settlement's cabin-dwelling majority. Crane opened with numbers. He had counted the structures on the ridge, tallied the families, calculated the percentage of the settlement's population living in what he called unapproved temporary shelters. He produced Webb Granger's inspection report, which cited 14 specific non-compliance issues across the 6 domes, all written in language that sounded technical, until you looked for the citations, at which point you found that the technical standards had no source beyond the document itself. He built his case with the patience of a man who had won arguments before by accumulating momentum rather than logic, each point individually, minor collectively, creating the impression of overwhelming evidence. The room was following him. She could see it in the posture of the people she knew were uncertain. Leaning slightly forward, faces attentive, the body language of people being persuaded. Jonas Burrell stood up, not quickly, with the deliberate rising of a man who has decided to speak in public and is not going to change his mind about it once he's on his feet. He stood with his bandaged arm visible, the gauze still clean from her last change 3 days ago. He did not look at Crane, he looked at the room. "I want to describe a specific night," Jonas said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a large man who does not often speak in public and therefore is heard when he does. He described the Burrell cabin. He described the chimney. He described the smoke, the frozen door, the window he'd broken with his arm. He described Rosie's face. He described what had changed the outcome of that night. Crane waited for him to finish with the patience of a man who believes he has a sufficient response to anything. Then, "The situation you're describing, Mr. Burrell, reflects poor cabin maintenance. Chimney inspection is the homeowner's responsibility. I don't see how that connects to the structural issues at stake tonight." Jonas looked at him for a moment. The room was very quiet. "I've been building structures in this territory for 11 years. The chimney in my cabin was built correctly. It was built for the wrong wind angle." He paused. "The wood I burned in it produces more smoke than it should because the wood I purchased as seasoned stock was green cut. I have 3 years of receipts marked seasoned. I'd like to understand how the community's structural safety review addresses that." The room shifted, not dramatically, but shifted the way a load shifts in a wagon when the road changes. Grade the center of gravity, moving without the vehicle stopping. Crane's expression did not change, but his hands resting on the table before him pressed slightly flatter against the surface. Pastor Voss stood up from the second row. He did not raise his voice. He had a preacher's understanding that quiet carried farther than volume when the room was already paying attention. "I've been in the structures on the ridge. I'd like everyone here to ask themselves one question before we vote on anything tonight. In the last 2 months, which buildings in Harrow Flats have not had a smoke problem?" The answer to this question was not complicated. The room knew the answer. Crane knew that the room knew the answer, which was the moment the meeting stopped being a proceeding he controlled and became a conversation he was participating in. Sheriff Aldgate, who had sat in the back row without speaking, opened his notebook. He was not writing anything. He was simply visible, the law present as witness rather than enforcer, which was sometimes the only form the law could usefully take. Verity had not spoken. She sat near the east wall with Stellan beside her, watching the room do the work she had hoped it would do. Understanding that her role in this specific moment was to be present without being the center of it, to let the evidence speak in voices the room could hear, without the defensive friction of hearing it from her. The meeting ended without a formal resolution. There was no vote, there were no official conclusions. But when people left, they left in different configurations than they'd arrived, the uncertain families drifting toward Jonas, toward the Garrities, asking questions rather than making statements. Webb Granger rolled up his inspection report and tucked it under his arm and did not meet anyone's eyes on his way out. Crane stayed behind as the room emptied. He was still sitting at the table when Verity passed him on the way to the door. She did not pause. She did not look at him. But she felt his stillness as she passed, the particular stillness of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already calculated correctly, and she understood that the mistake he'd made was not the greenwood and not the inspection notices. The mistake was assuming that in a cold winter authority over supply was the same as authority over survival. He'd confused the two. Winter was in the process of correcting that confusion with a thoroughness he had not anticipated. Outside, the temperature had dropped another 12 degrees since the meeting started. She could tell by the sound the snow made underfoot the shift from compression to a dry, fine squeak that Wyoming snow made at extreme cold, a sound like something crystalline being tested at its molecular limits. She looked up at Black Spine Ridge. The domes on the slope were visible as low, dark mounds against the white, each with its thin thread of smoke rising straight up in the still air between wind gusts. Thin, steady threads of smoke. The kind that meant everything inside was exactly as it should be. Stellan walked beside her, matching her pace up the slope, with the ease of someone who had been climbing this particular terrain for 4 months and knew every change in grade. He had not spoken since they left the meeting. Then halfway up, Pastor Voss didn't tell them what to think. "No," she said. He just asked them one question. She looked at the smoke threads from the domes above. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do in a room full of people is ask the question they've been avoiding. He thought about this for several steps. Then, what question were you not asking tonight? She looked at him, at his father's coloring gone silver in the moonlight, at the particular sharpness in his face that she had not put there and could not take credit for. She thought about what question she had been not asking and understood that it was not a question about Crane or the meeting or the winter at all. It was a question about what came after, about what Harrow Flats would be, when the snow melted, about whether knowledge survived the emergency that had created it or dissolved back into the comfortable habits that emergencies temporarily interrupted. She did not have an answer. She climbed. The night of February 8th arrived without the drama of a storm. No wind, no snowfall, no atmospheric theater. Just cold descending in the hours after midnight, with the quiet finality of a verdict that has already been written, requiring only delivery. The thermometer outside the general store, which Sheriff Aldgate checked at 2 in the morning during his rounds, had passed every previous mark it had ever recorded. It settled at 58 degrees below zero, with the indifference of a scale finding its level, and stayed there. Verity had been awake since midnight. Not from cold, the dome held its temperature with the same steady competence it had demonstrated for 3 months, the clay firebox burning 2 willow sticks at the precise rate that maintained 36 degrees without pushing heat into the walls. She was awake because she had learned over the course of this winter that the nights requiring the most attention were not the ones that announced themselves with noise. The dangerous nights came quietly. They let you sleep while they worked. She moved through the settlement's 14 domes before first light, checking each one in sequence. She carried the iron probe not for snow testing, but as a tool for assessing the cold sump depth by sound, tapping it against the interior floor near the cold trap entrance, listening for the resonance change that indicated whether cold air was pooling correctly in the hollow below sleeping level or rising into the habitable space. In 12 of the 14 domes, the resonance was correct. In one, a family had blocked the cold sump entrance with stored goods, inadvertently eliminating the mechanism that made the shelter work. She moved the goods without waking anyone. Restored. The channel checked. The flame moved on. In the last dome, a very new one built by a young family who had come up the slope only 3 weeks ago, the storm skin had thinned on the northeast face. She packed fresh powder into the surface with her palms, working in a temperature that made her face feel like something abstract and borrowed. And when the face was sealed, she stood back, confirmed the patch was even, then climbed back toward her own shelter. Cass was waiting outside when she returned. He had been on the slope himself, moving in the opposite direction through the settlement's domes, covering the homes she hadn't reached yet. They had not arranged this. They had simply developed through the compressed education of a Wyoming winter, the same understanding of what the night required. He looked at her without expression. She looked at him. Neither spoke. The information they needed to exchange had already been exchanged in the circuit they'd each completed. The settlement was intact. She went inside. She lay down beside Stellan, who had not moved. She put her hand on his chest, counted, found the rhythm exactly as it should be. She closed her eyes. Jonas Burrell found her at 7 in the morning. He came at a run, which was its own information. Jonas moved with the deliberate economy of a large man who understood that running was a statement, not merely a speed. His face was the color of old ash. He stopped outside the entrance, and his voice arrived before he crouched to the tunnel level. Crane is down, found him on the floor. Celia Whitmore saw through his window when she passed the glass, had cleared of frost on the inside, which meant the fire was out, which meant something was wrong. Verity was moving before he finished. She came through the entrance tunnel and straightened into the morning cold. Stellan appeared at the tunnel opening behind her. She looked at her son, Stay. His expression showed no argument, only the recognition of a child who understood the difference between being excluded from something and being trusted with something else. He went back inside. Crane's cabin was the finest structure in Harrow Flats by a significant margin. Double-walled log construction, properly chinked with a stone foundation and a chimney built by a mason brought in from Laramie. It had been designed to demonstrate what sufficient money could accomplish against a Wyoming winter, which it had done adequately through 4 previous seasons. What it had not been designed for was a sustained temperature of 58 below zero, combined with the particular atmospheric inversion that had settled over the valley overnight, holding cold air in the low ground where the cabin sat, and preventing the chimney from maintaining any meaningful draft. The fire had died around midnight. The door had frozen shut by 2. The window on the south face showed a cleared circle in the interior frost, which was what Celia Whitmore had seen when the body inside stops producing heat, the frost pattern on glass changes. Verity noted this with the clinical detachment of a nurse reading a sign and moved to the door. She hit it with her shoulder twice, found it immovable, looked at the frame, identified the exact location of the frost seal, took the iron probe from her coat, worked it into the gap between door and frame, at the seal point levered. The ice cracked. She did it twice more, top and bottom, then hit the door again with her full weight. It opened. The cold inside was different from the cold outside, stale, used with the particular quality of air that has been in contact with a dying fire for hours. Crane was on the floor 6 feet from the cold stove, on his side knees drawn up. Lip color, gray-blue. Breathing present shallow, the characteristic pattern of carbon monoxide compromise, rather than pure cold exposure. His body had been fighting the wrong thing in the air before the cold became the primary threat, which meant the recovery sequence was specific. She worked with the same absence of sentiment she had brought to Rosie Burrell's airway weeks earlier. Different patient, different presentation, same fundamental principle. The body has resources it cannot access when the system is overwhelmed, and the nurse's job is to remove the overwhelming factor so the system can recover itself. She moved him closer to the door to the fresher air entering from outside. She checked his airway, confirmed it was clear, monitored the breathing rate. She found a buffalo robe in the corner of the room, wrapped it around him. She waited. His breathing deepened at the 8-minute mark. At 11 minutes, his eyes opened, unfocused at first, then finding her face with the slow visual tracking of someone returning from a significant distance. She checked his pulse, noted its quality improving, watched his lips move towards something closer to their natural color. Jonas was in the doorway. He had not come in. Some instinct had told him this was not a space for him, which was correct. Verity looked at him without turning from Crane. He needs warm fluid when he can swallow. Whatever you have that's hot. Jonas left. She looked back at Crane. He was watching her with an expression she could not classify, not gratitude exactly, not shame exactly. Something that belonged to the space between those words, where men sometimes find themselves when the structures they built to manage their interactions with the world have failed simultaneously. Then Stellan appeared at the door behind her. She had told him to stay. She looked at him, prepared the correction, but he spoke first. I brought the fire tin. He held up the small tin box she kept on the shelf above the firebox, the one with the prepared tinder. He had known without being told that the stove in this cabin would need to be restarted. That warm air inside the building was part of the recovery process, that a dead fire needed tinder before it needed fuel. He had looked at the situation from the outside and identified what would be useful, which was a level of inference she had not explicitly taught him. She looked at her son for a moment. Restart the stove, small flame first. He went to the stove with the tin box and went to work. Crane's eyes had been open through this exchange. He had heard the boy's words, had watched Verity redirect him with 3 words. Instead of praise, had watched a 9-year-old begin rebuilding a fire in the home of a man who had spent months working against his mother. He swallowed carefully, tested his voice, found it. Why? She held his pulse between her fingers, counting. The same reason I checked every dome on the slope at 3 in the morning. Because the cold doesn't ask who deserves the 58 below. He was quiet. The small flame Stellan had coaxed from the tinder began to establish itself in the stove's firebox, and for the first time since she'd entered the cabin, had a future that included warmth. Crane watched the boy work and said nothing more. But something in his face had changed, a particular quality of stillness that was not unconsciousness and not calculation, but something that happens in a man when he has been seen clearly at his most reduced by the person he least expected to look. She released his wrist. Drink what Jonas brings. Stay horizontal for another hour. She stood, gathered the medical bag, looked once more at the stove where Stellan was nursing the flame with the patient attention she had spent 4 months teaching him. She walked outside into the cold. The morning after the coldest night in Wyoming Territory's recorded history had a quality of silence that was different from ordinary silence. Ordinary silence was the absence of sound. This was the presence of aftermath, the specific quiet of a place where something significant has occurred, and the air itself seems to be waiting to see what comes next. Sheriff Aldgate began his circuit of the settlement at first light, and the story he compiled cabin by cabin was not complex, but it was complete. 7 cabins in the low valley showed the same pattern doors that had frozen shut overnight, interior temperatures that had dropped below the threshold of safe habitation, residents who had spent the night in varying degrees of crisis, burning furniture for fuel when their wood ran out, stuffing gaps in the chinking with clothing. In 2 cases, spending the full night under every piece of fabric they owned, unable to leave. No deaths. The margin on several of them was narrow enough that Aldgate did not want to calculate it precisely. On Black Spine Ridge, 14 families emerged from 14 intact domes between 6:30 in the morning. They came out one at a time, adjusting to the light brushing powder from their coats. The children came last, carried or held close, their faces bright from sleep rather than drained from sleeplessness. The thin threads of smoke from the dome vents continued their steady rise, unchanged from the night before, unchanged from every night before that. Aldgate climbed the slope with his notebook. He stood at the edge of the dome settlement, looked at what he saw, opened the notebook, began drawing a diagram. He had been a sheriff for 11 years in 2 territories, and he had developed the habit of documenting things that worked as carefully as he documented things that failed, because in his experience, the 2 were equally likely to be forgotten. He drew the positions of the domes, the entrance tunnel orientations, the spacing between shelters. He measured the smoke vent heights by eye, estimating, noting his estimates. Verity watched him work from 20 feet away. For next year, he said, without looking up, his voice carrying the flat practicality of a man who had already moved past analysis into planning. I'm going to want to know how long it takes to build one of these, what materials are needed, who in this settlement has the skills to do it right. She thought about October. She thought about what she'd known in October that nobody had wanted to hear. It takes 8 days with 2 competent builders. The skills aren't unusual. What's unusual is being willing to set aside what you already think you know about construction. Aldgate nodded, writing. That's the part that takes longest. Yes. 2 weeks passed after the coldest night. The temperature rose back toward what passed for manageable 20 below, then 15, then on a remarkable afternoon in late February, 6 below, which felt almost hospitable by comparison. People began to move again, to visit between cabins, to resume the social habits that extreme cold suspends. The settlement recalibrated itself in the particular way communities recalibrate after a shared crisis, slowly, unevenly, with some people moving toward changed behavior, while others moved back toward familiar patterns as quickly as the familiar patterns became available. On the 3rd morning of March, Cass was gone. No announcement, no farewell. Verity waited 2 days before accepting it as departure rather than absence. On the fifth morning, she went to his lean-to on the North Timberline. The structure was intact, recently patched, as well-maintained as everything Cass maintained. Inside, the tools he'd kept there were gone. The supply stores were gone. The space had the emptiness of something vacated with intention rather than abandoned in haste. Stellan found the proof of it before she could show him. He came back down the slope in the mid-morning, carrying something in both hands, held with the care of something important. He showed it to her without speaking: the iron probe, Donal's iron probe, the one she had set against the wall in October, the one Cass had told her to keep on the slope. It had been returned to the base of the pine tree where Cass had established his outdoor workspace, set there, with deliberate placement, cleaned of rust, tied with a length of new rawhide in a simple practical knot. He had returned it in better condition than she'd used it, which was the standard he applied to everything he borrowed from the world. She took it from Stellan's hands. She turned it slowly. The rawhide was new, the iron was clean. She understood then, with the clarity that comes from knowing a person's patterns well enough to read their silences, that this was not abandonment. A man who abandons leaves nothing. A man who trusts completely returns what he borrowed repaired. Stellan watched her face. He's not coming back. No. He left because we don't need him to come back. She looked at her son. At 9 years old, he had arrived at the understanding that took most people years and considerable loss to reach, that the best kind of help concludes itself when it's no longer necessary, that departure is sometimes the form that trust takes. She pressed the iron probe into his hands. Keep this. Learn to use it the way he used it for reading, not just for testing. He closed both hands around it with the gravity of someone receiving a thing that carries obligation with it. Aldous Crane left Harrow Flats on a Thursday morning in the first week of March, his wagon loaded with the portable elements of his inventory, his trading post locked behind him. He was headed to Cheyenne, where he had business interests that predated Harrow Flats and would outlast it. He did not announce the departure. He simply prepared for it with the thoroughness of a man who understood how to close an operation efficiently. He came to see her the morning before he left. He came to the dome itself, which required him to crouch at the entrance tunnel to navigate the cold trap on hands and knees to enter her space on the terms the space required. She watched him straighten inside the dome, look at the curved walls, the buffalo hide panels held an inch from the snow with their rawhide loops, the sleeping platform at its raised height, the cold sump visible below the main floor level near the entrance. He looked at all of this without the evaluating dismissal he'd brought to everything she'd done since September. He looked at it the way Jonas had looked at the King block, recognizing a solution to a problem he had previously refused to acknowledge existed. He took an envelope from his coat. She did not take it immediately. She looked at him instead, waiting for what came before the envelope. Not an apology, which she had never expected, but the thing underneath an apology, the recognition that required a man to see himself accurately after a period of seeing himself otherwise. He met her eyes directly, which he had not done in September, not in October, not in any of their subsequent exchanges. He met them the way you meet the eyes of someone you have finally stopped managing. The North Slope is good land, his voice carrying the careful flatness of a man choosing precision over rhetoric. Better drainage than the valley floor, protected from the worst of the southwest exposure. I should have seen it in the summer. He held the envelope steady. It should belong to someone who knows how to listen to it. She took the envelope. Inside, a land transfer document notarized with a Laramie seal. He had arranged it in advance, which meant this was not an impulse, but a decision he'd made with enough lead time to do it properly. The document transferred ownership of the northern slope of Black Spine Ridge from the ridge line to the valley floor on the north face to Verity Calhoun and her heirs. He had described the property boundaries with the care of a man who understood land. She looked at the document for a moment, then at him. His expression told her he had heard what she'd said to Stellan in that cabin, the words spoken over his unconscious body absorbed before his eyes were fully open. He had carried those words out of the cabin and into 2 weeks of recovery and emerged from them changed in the specific way that people change when a truth arrives at the right moment of their particular vulnerability. He left without waiting for more. She listened to him work his way back through the entrance tunnel, listened to his footsteps on the packed snow outside, listened to them diminish toward the valley. She stood in the dome with the document in her hands for a long moment, then folded it along its own crease lines and placed it in the medical bag beside Donald's instruments beside the Fort Laramie weather report that had started all of this. March arrived in Wyoming Territory, the way March always arrived in Wyoming Territory, not as spring exactly, but as winter's first concession. A slight loosening of the grip, a few degrees of additional sunlight per day, that accumulated slowly into permission for the snow to begin thinking about the process of becoming water. The melt was gradual. The domes on the slope did not collapse dramatically. They subsided, softening from the top down, the exterior storm skin going first, then the upper courses becoming rounded, where the block edges had been crisp, then the king block itself settling incrementally into the space below it, as the compression that had held it in place through 4 months of everything Wyoming could manage slowly found less to work against. The families on the ridge did not try to delay this. They did not reinforce the softening walls or prop the settling courses. They watched it happen with the equanimity of people who had understood from the beginning that the shelter's purpose was specific to the season that had required it, that it was not permanent by design rather than by failure. Verity began taking the dome apart from the inside, working systematically from the interior out, removing the buffalo hide panels, rolling each one for storage, checking the rawhide loops for condition, setting aside what could be reused. The hides were dry, all of them. The system she had built in November, the air gap between hide and wall, the carefully maintained flame, the cold sump that kept floor-level air from carrying moisture upward, had worked through every night of the hardest Wyoming winter on record without producing a single piece of damp bedding. She folded each hide with the deliberate care of someone storing something that will be needed again. Stellan moved through the interior behind her, gathering smaller items, the tin cups, the lamp, the firebox tools. He picked up the king block before it disappeared entirely into slush, turned it in his hands, feeling what remained of its shape. He had watched her set it in October, had understood something of what it meant structurally. Now he held it as it became ordinary again. Did the house die? His voice was not dramatic. It was the question of a child trying to classify an experience that his existing vocabulary didn't quite cover. Verity looked at the wall, at the coarse snow returning to uncoursed snow, the structure dissolving back into the material it had always been. It finished, her voice carrying neither consolation nor correction. It did exactly what it was built to do for exactly as long as it was needed. That's not dying. That's completion. He set the king block down and watched it continue its slow return. After a moment, "Is that what Pa did?" She was quiet for several seconds, not avoiding thinking because the question deserved the thought. She looked at the pine board outside, visible through the open entrance, Donald's name still legible in the board's weathered surface. She thought about what his death had been, about what it meant to be the person who discovered that the building that was supposed to protect him had not. She thought about whether what she had spent this winter building was an answer to that discovery, or simply the next thing she had been required to do. "Your father did what he knew how to do," she said finally, "in the circumstances he had. The difference between what he knew and what would have saved him, that's what we spent this winter learning." She looked at her son. "Carry that. Not the loss, the lesson." He picked up the iron probe from its place on the sleeping shelf. He carried it outside into the March light, and she watched him go through the entrance tunnel into the beginning of the season that had been on the other side of this winter all along. Spring came to Harrow Flats in increments that required attention to notice. The creek sounds returned, first a murmur under the last ice that grew to something audible by mid-March. Then mud, the particular productive mud of Wyoming spring that meant the earth was thawed deep enough to do business with again. Then the first grass, pale and tentative in the south-facing pockets where sun hit earliest. The settlement did not rebuild itself the way it had been. Jonas Burrell had been thinking through the winter in the particular way craftsmen think. Not talking about it, just revising internally, applying new information to accumulated practice until the revision had completed itself. His first spring commission was a cabin for a new family arriving from Kansas, the kind of family that came to Wyoming Territory with ambition, but not yet with knowledge. Jonas sat with them for an afternoon before he picked up a tool. He explained about chimney orientation relative to prevailing wind patterns. He explained about cold air density and why the sleeping area should be elevated above the main floor. He explained about fire size and why a modest, sustained flame was more effective than a large one. The knowledge had become his knowledge, now integrated into his practice. which was exactly how knowledge should work, not attributed but absorbed, carried forward in the next thing built. Hattie Burrell spent several weeks in April going from family to family in the settlement with the buffalo hide panel technique, showing women how to install the air gap against any wall where condensation was a problem. She moved through this work with the competence of someone who has learned something thoroughly and finds teaching it clarifying rather than burdensome. Rosie came with her, 3 years old and healthy, with no memory of the December night that had reordered her mother's understanding of the winter in The Woman on the Ridge. Pastor Voss gave a sermon in April that the settlement discussed for the following 2 weeks. He spoke about the relationship between humility before the natural world and wisdom within it, about how the knowledge that had kept Harrow Flats intact through the worst winter in territorial history had come from a widow who had listened to what the weather was actually saying rather than what people expected it to say. He did not name her. He had asked her beforehand if she minded being unnamed. She had told him she preferred it. The knowledge was what mattered. The attribution was just social accounting. On the last day of April, a small gathering formed outside the settlement's general store, not organized, just accumulated the way Wyoming Territory gatherings accumulated, people arriving because other people were already there. Someone had built a fire in a pit ring and suspended a pot above it, which was an invitation. Families came with whatever they had to add to the pot. The conversation was the kind that follows a shared ordeal, wide-ranging, frequently, funny, occasionally serious, in the way people get serious when they've been through something together that changed their understanding of what together meant. Stellan was somewhere in the outer edge of the group with children his age, several of whom had spent the winter in domes with their families. The social architecture of childhood had shifted. The label that had followed him through October and November had simply dropped out of use, replaced by nothing, which was its own kind of recognition, the neutral ordinariness that is more powerful than any positive designation, because it is permanent in a way that positive labels rarely are. A man named Fergus, who had arrived in Harrow Flats in February with no prior acquaintance with the settlement's winter, sat near the fire and asked the question that had apparently been circulating in the gathering for a while before arriving at him. What do you call it? What you built up there? Verity was across the fire from him. She had heard the question being passed around the group like a dish someone wanted a name for. She looked across the fire at the slope of Black Spine Ridge, at the north face where the dome depressions were still visible in the softening snow. 14 shallow bowls where 14 families had spent a winter learning something they would carry forward. The pine board with Donald's name on it was still there, still standing, the letters weathered but legible from a distance, if you knew to look. She looked at Stellan sitting 20 feet away with the iron probe across his knees, explaining something to the children around him with the patient precision of a 9-year-old who has been trusted with real knowledge and takes the responsibility seriously. He was demonstrating the angle of the probe against the ground, showing the technique Cass had taught him, which Cass had developed alone over 40 Wyoming winters, which she had then learned on this ridge, which Stellan had absorbed through 4 months of watching both of them. She watched her son pass it forward, and she held the weight of what that chain represented, the thread of useful knowledge that moved from hand to hand through the specific winter that had required it. A borrowed winter, she said. Fergus looked at her. Several people around the fire looked at her. She held the phrase for a moment before completing it. Not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to say it correctly, the way you want to say correctly, the thing you have spent an entire winter learning. You don't defeat winter. You borrow enough warmth to remember what spring looks like. The fire crackled. Someone across the group laughed at something unrelated, and the laughter moved through the gathering with the ease of people who have relearned how to be easy with each other. The pod above the fire issued a slow democratic steam. She looked at Black Spine Ridge one more time. At the shallow bowls in the snow, each one the negative space of a shelter that had held its purpose completely. At the pine board with its carved letters, weathered by wind that had never stopped coming over the ridge, the way it always came, the way it would come next winter, indifferent to the settlements in the valley below, indifferent to the preparations people made or failed to make. The difference she had learned was not in the wind. The wind was the same wind it had always been. The difference was in whoever had learned in the long, difficult season preceding it how to listen before it spoke. She stood, set her cup down, moved to where Stellan was sitting. He looked up. She put her hand briefly on the top of his head. Not sentiment, not comfort, just contact, the way you touch a structure you've built to confirm its holding. He leaned into it for a moment, then straightened back to his demonstration, placing the iron probe at its correct angle against the ground, showing the children around him exactly how the reading was done. She watched. The iron found the snow answered.